Okay, so for discussion board number 4, talking about the Oxford scholarly sources on the women's suffrage movement, this review of the books, of the 3 scholarly books from the Oxford Scholarship Online, identifies methodology, general content, and conclusions related to my perspective dissertation on the topic of the radicalism of the women's suffrage movement in the United States during the 20th century. Now, the 3 sources that I looked at from the collection are actually 3 very different sources, but they provide information that is pretty potentially useful to the my perspective dissertation. So the first book I looked at is by Holly McCammon and Leanne Banaszak. Holly McCammon is a pretty prolific writer of women's history or women's suffrage history. So this particular book is a pretty good one when it comes to the 19th Amendment. So the book is entitled 100 Years of the 19th Amendment, an appraisal of women's political activism. Now, this one isn't actually about the 19th Amendment itself, but what has happened since the 19th Amendment. So for this particular book, I would use that towards the end of my dissertation to say, okay, since the 19th Amendment, what have we done? Okay, so what this does is it looks back at the years since the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and asks the question, how has women's political engagement unfolded over the last 100 years? What have we done since then? McCammon and Banaszak look at women's participation in politics as well as their participation in women's movements. And what they reveal is that women have made substantial strides in politics, like voting at higher rates than men, gaining greater leadership roles in political and social movements, but that there are still barriers to gender equality. They also explore the diverse experiences of women from various backgrounds, uh, including different racial, ethnic, class, and gender identities, as well as those with different sexual orientations, educational, and political backgrounds. Now, although it traces the presence of women in politics for 100 years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the idea of the book is to look at the contents and to look towards the next 100 years of women's political engagement and think about what that might look like. Now, the second book I looked at is a book by Martin Pugh entitled The March of the Women, a revisionist analysis of the campaign for women's suffrage, 1866 to 1914. Now, this one is a comprehensive study of the campaign for women's suffrage in Britain. And the reason I kind of use this particular source is that a lot of the women's suffrage, particularly the militancy of the women's suffrage movement in the United States, is based off of the British suffrage movement. So Pugh's book says, while there was a common held belief that suffragism underwent a decline in the 1890s, Pugh sets out to prove that they did not, that contrary to belief, suffragists had effectively won the suffrage argument by 1900. In order to support this viewpoint, though, Pugh points to the ineffectiveness of the anti-suffrage campaign in Britain during the same period. He also examines the militant tactics that showed up during the Edwardian period and shows how Pankhurst, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter, and the WSPU managed to combine their tactics of attacking the British establishment, along with its value for also tapping into the same establishment for support and the funds necessary to continue their crusades. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, there were the non-militant suffragists who gathered most of their support from the working class and the emerging Labor Party of the time. So the importance of this, of course, is the the militants of the women like Pankhurst and the WSPU, considering that Alice Paul, the leader of the National Women's Party, got her start with Pankhurst. So this is one of the reasons that I might use this as sort of a background to at the beginning maybe of my dissertation. The final book that I looked at was a book by Lauren C. Santangelo, which was entitled Suffrage and the City, New York Women Battle for the Ballot. What drew me to this book was the title. I love the play on words and the title Suffrage and the City. If anybody's ever heard of Sex and the City, it kind of sort of plays on that title, and of course it's in New York, set in New York City. And it's a great introduction to what has become one of the United States' most fantastic movements. Her book looks at the ways that the demand for women's rights intersected with the history, the politics, and the culture in New York City during the Progressive Era. New York City actually helped to shape the possibilities for suffragists who were campaigning from within the city for the national movement. These activists, these suffragists, helped to sort of redefine the urban experience of suffragists, particularly for white middle-class women. This group was one of the largest to originally participate in the movement in both New York City and in the country as a whole. And they weren't the meek little angels, but very militant women who were bent on advocating for suffrage. According to Santangelo, it was the fight for suffrage in the largest city in the nation that mobilized suffragists and contested urban etiquette as women fought to gain visibility in the movement. This book shows that New York City was one of the biggest stages in the fight for suffrage, along with Washington, D.C. And I think that this particular book will be particularly useful in showcasing the fight for suffrage and the militancy of women in the suffrage movement. So that is my discussion board number 4 for this week. Thank you.